For storing your Pokemon, before Pokemon Home, Pokemon Bank, and even My Pokemon Ranch, there was Pokemon Box, Ruby and Sapphire. A neat little storage utility for the GameCube that lets you store up to 1,500 Pokemon from the Gen 3 games on a GameCube memory card. It also lets you play your Ruby or Sapphire on the big screen with your save file, no Game Boy player required, lets you showcase your Pokemon in these neat little 3D dioramas, and lets you take pictures and use them as box wallpapers. There are also gift Pokemon eggs that can be shiny and have very unique moves. It's even got a cool Absol on the cover. But in reality, this game has some issues. And I'm not even talking about the price tag on the North American copies of the games now. And over the span of this past weekend, I dedicated myself to fixing these issues. Let's talk about them. Let's say you want to start a new save file on your Ruby version. So you move all your Pokemon into Box before restarting. Then, when you start your new save file, hoping to reunite with your old friends, the game hits you with this when you try to withdraw them. Yeah, you have to have 100 Pokemon registered in your Pokédex to withdraw Pokemon that you yourself didn't deposit. That's half the Hoenn Dex, and more than what's required to unlock the National Dex in Fire Red and Leaf Green. But with Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Emerald, there's even more. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, you're unable to withdraw or even deposit Pokemon into Pokemon Box if you haven't done the Sevi Islands post-game quest, where you deliver the Sapphire to Celio. So basically, you can't use Pokemon Box until you've beaten everything in the entire game. Unfortunately, since Emerald is also not quite exactly Ruby and Sapphire, it gets this same treatment, until you defeat the Pokemon League. Knowing all that, at least your Ruby and Sapphire can use Box before beating the game. So let's whip out the Japanese version that's way cheaper than the American version, and hook up our English Pokemon Ruby. And nothing happens. That brings us to the third issue, compatibility. There are 3 different international versions of Pokemon Box. The Japanese version, which is only compatible with Japanese 3rd gen games. The PAL version, which is compatible with a whopping 4 languages of 3rd gen games, but not the original Japanese versions. And then finally, the extremely expensive crown jewel of some people's GameCube collection, and by far the most expensive version of Pokemon Box. The absolutely stunning North American version that only supports English, and not any of the other languages. This came out after the European version, by the way. Is this really that much of an issue, though? Like, is someone actually gonna own an English Ruby, and a Japanese Sapphire, and a Spanish Fire Red, and an English Emerald, and a Japanese Emerald, and a box copy of Sweet Life of Zack and Cody? Yeah, actually, probably some dork who could have used PK Hex to move his Pokemon around but uses Box instead because he thinks it looks cooler. There's always been a workaround for this, where you can trade a Pokemon you want to store from an incompatible game to a compatible game, since all Gen 3 games can trade with each other, but this is only really useful if you're trying to store a couple Pokemon. If you're trying to store multiple boxes, you might spend all day trading, which is not fun. So, how did I fix these issues? Well, I created a patch for the game. I've created patches for all 3 international versions of the game, and you can run it if you have a modded Wii or GameCube. And it's fully compatible with all current Box save files. You can download this patch from Project Pokemon. Alternatively, I've also created some action replay codes that can be used with the retail copy of the game. And these codes can address 2 out of 3 of the issues here. So now, let's talk about how I used my programming skills to fix each of these issues. Let's start with the easiest issue to fix, the Pokédex. So I opened up the game in Dolphin's debug mode, where I'm able to step through individual pieces of the game's code as it happens. And I used a program to create a decomp of the game, which takes the near unreadable machine code of the game's executable and interprets it into a format that's slightly more human readable. For this dex check, I knew I needed to look for the number 100 or something really close to it. And I found this one comparison that was getting checked every time I placed a Pokemon that was looking at the number 99. So I just tried changing it to 0. And what do you know, it worked. So now let's talk about fixing the second issue, the problem with Fire Red and Leaf Green. And this all stems from how the game was designed. They wanted you to have to use only the first generation of Pokemon until you get the National Dex in the post-game. even going as far as preventing Golbat from evolving into Crobat until you've beaten the game. So they implemented a lot of different flags on your save file that prevent you from trading with other games until you reach a certain point. And since Emerald was developed right after Fire Red and Leaf Green, a lot of these changes were also carried over to that game. But in my testing, when I doctored a save file of Fire Red to connect with Colosseum and XD, the other GameCube games early, I noticed that Box was still not connecting with the game. Meaning Box uses different criteria from the other two GameCube games to see if a Pokemon can be withdrawn or deposited. I thought that there would maybe be a weird loophole to this, like maybe this flag was actually tied to something completely unrelated, but it turns out it's tied to this flag that in some decomp projects is referred to as Champion Save Warp. And as expected, this flag only gets set when you hand the Sapphire to Celio or defeat the Hall of Fame in Emerald. By the way, as a side note, Emerald for whatever reason can trade with Colosseum at any point but not XD. Shout out to Shiny Hunters, Twisted Motive, and Sonics for telling me about that. But does any of this information about flags matter? No. Because the whole check for it in the first place just sets a status code afterwards that'll throw the error. And if we change that status code to 0, the game will think everything's fine. And just let us deposit and withdraw. Epic. So now let's tackle the hardest issue, international compatibility. All of this stems from a pesky 4-letter codename that every Game Boy Advance game has, that you can read on the label of most cartridges. Each international version of Pokemon Box checks this codename and decides whether or not it's a valid Pokemon game. And of course the criteria is different for each one. To make things even more complicated, half this code runs on the GameCube, and the other half runs on the Game Boy, using the program that the GameCube sends when it's linked. Back in 2014, someone by the name of Ralph created some action replay codes that let you use the other language versions of Ruby Sapphire. But unfortunately, in my testing, these codes only worked on emulator and not on console. Only worked for one language at a time, and even with the codes active, did not support Fire Red, Leaf Green, or Emerald. But these codes gave me an excellent place to start. For checking the version of the game, in a few spots in the GameCube and Game Boy code, there's something that looks a little bit like this, where it compares this 4-letter thing from the Game Boy cartridge that's currently inserted with Ruby and Sapphire's internal codes. Depending on which version of the game you're playing, English or Japanese Ruby will return 0, English or Japanese Sapphire will return 1, and anything else, including French, German, and Spanish Ruby and Sapphire, will return 2. And the American version has some additional checks in place that immediately reject any game that's not in English. Get around these parts and we speak American. So I removed that code from the GameCube side of things and swapped out the complicated American and European Game Boy code for the simplified Japanese code. And after doing that, it suddenly had the same functionality as the European version and could also read Japanese Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Emerald. However, the problem remained of Japanese Ruby and Sapphire. And that all goes back to this code that I showed here earlier, where depending on if you have these strings ending in an E or a J, it will only work with English or Japanese Ruby Sapphire, not both at the same time. So because I'm lazy with these kinds of things, I came up with a hacky solution to it. I just made it check the first letter. If it starts with an A, it's a Ruby version. If it starts with a B, it's not. Obviously this has some drawbacks. Like, no game will get detected as a Sapphire anymore. Your Sapphire version will be looked at as a Ruby. But this is purely cosmetic, outside of Adventure Mode, which is its own unique beast. The Game Boy Player is an actual Game Boy that will read the data from your cartridge. Box Ruby and Sapphire's Adventure Mode is just an emulator that plays a ROM of Ruby or Sapphire with your uploaded save file. So we can play Ruby with a Sapphire save, or with an action replay, we can do vice versa, which sort of fixes the whole issue that I created with that hacky code. But another unfortunate side effect that I don't have a fix for is, in the European version, Adventure Mode will always load in English with my modified version of the game at the moment. I may go back and try and find a way to fix this someday. But honestly, the box functionality was my main focus when creating this. But yeah, that's certainly how I spent a weekend of my life working on that. And I might go back and try and fix some of those issues sometime in the future, as well as some other features like allowing games with bad eggs to connect. Anyway, I got lots of other videos to be working on right now, like I'd have to edit these, so look forward to that sometime soon, and I will see you next time.